Grace and peace to you, friends. Good evening. Hello, my name is Brett Swanson. I'm the pastor here at Wauwatosa Presbyterian Church, and on behalf of the congregation, I say welcome to you joining us here in person, those who are with us online. Special welcome to all of you. I hope this is the first of a series of community events that we could start hosting here in this space, and we start with one of our favorites. We say a special welcome to Beatrice McKenzie, author of the Wongs of Beloit, who I've gotten a chance to know just briefly now online and now in person, and I am thankful that she is here. And I would say guests, but that's either inaccurate or just totally false, because Mary is as much of this church as the pews. Mary and Dave, longtime members here, now living in Saratoga, California, my old hometown. So we switched. I came here, they went, no. So we're excited here. When this event was conceived, it was part of an all-church read, and we're thankful that Mary and Beatrice will come by again tomorrow. Before worship, we will have a adult enrichment, adult education opportunity, which is a very kind of casual conversation. So, the inspiration for this event, of course, was not only getting to know this story that many of us had heard about here and there during Mary and Dave's time in the congregation, but also to name the importance of this story in our current conversations here in the United States and how we can be better aware of what I think tonight represents as a bit of counter-testimony, where we hear a story from the neighborhood, from the living room, from a life lived, and not the one that we may always read in history books, if we read for them at all. And so I'm excited that you all are here. We're going to invite Beatrice up here for a moment. She'll speak, and then Mary has asked to say a few words, and then we're going to begin a time of conversation. I will do my best to moderate, and I'm thankful that Lisa Lynn Kirkpatrick, our pastoral resident, will come by with the mic. And we plead, we beg, if you will please speak into the mic and do so as clearly and as loudly as you can. Well, friends, thank you for being here this evening, and so I'd like to invite Beatrice up.
Thank you, Brett. Well, I'm thrilled to be back in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. I was in Beloit. I was teaching at Beloit College for my career, and I just retired last May, and so I have moved out to the state of Oregon. But I spent some time here when I was interviewing Mary, when she and David lived in the community. So it's really nice to have such a great turnout for the Wong history, because it's the Wongs specifically and American immigrants in general whose history we're celebrating here today. And when you read the Wongs of Beloit, Wisconsin, there will be no doubt that the family faced hardships, as many families in Wisconsin did during the Depression. No doubt that the Wongs served our country, our state, town of Beloit, and Beloit College for decades, and that their descendants continued to serve. And no doubt they benefited, again, as many of us did, from the largesse of their community, the state, and the nation. And then especially no doubt that the Wong kids, the youngest of whom is here with us today, overcame adversity and achieved great things, considering early setbacks of the loss of their father, his income, and his support. If you could advance the slide. So this is in no small measure due to the strength and diligence of their mother, Yi-Shi Wong, and their siblings, their older siblings, who in turn were supported by neighbors, teachers, clergy, and employers. Community made the difference for this family. So I'd like to begin by introducing elements of the book. I know that several of you read it. There's no quiz. I teased somebody earlier that there was a quiz and they got that look of horror. There's no quiz. Answering the questions what, when, where, and who the book is about, and then pointing out aspects of it that made it of interest to University of Wisconsin Press. So if you could advance. Since the book is a history, I should begin with the chronology and ask the question, what happened when? And the book addresses Chinese American history at two moments in particular. The first one, the period 1888 to 1923, when key Wong forebearers immigrated, the first one in 1888, Mary's father, Charles, in 1909, her grandfather, Wong Doucette, in 1912, and her mother, Yi Shi, in 1923. And this migration happened during a period of time called Chinese exclusion, later called Asian exclusion, 1882 to 1943, when Chinese were prohibited from immigrating to the United States and from naturalizing as American citizens if they did immigrate. This was the first time in American history that the US barred a category of immigrants because of their nationality, race, and social class. And I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes. So the questions we asked were, how did the Wongs immigrate in such a restrictive period? Why did they come to the Midwest when most Chinese stayed on the West Coast? And then the book also examines the other context, the thriving economy of post-World War I Beloit, when Charles and Yi Shi arrived there, which helps explain the draw of the city to these restaurateurs. That economy changed in the mid-20th century, from the 1930s into the 1980s. And during the Depression, the Wongs sought to sell their house and return to China, but they were unable to sell it, so they stayed. And then as the economy improved, the book discusses the tragic murder of Mary's dad, Charles, in 1937, and the way his death affected his wife and children. The setting for the next decades of the biography, as the children grew up, is the dramatic growth and then peak of industrial production during the World War II and Cold War eras. So peak production in Beloit occurred in 1955, before it declined in the 1970s and 80s. The where has already been introduced, but the book looks at emigration from the Pearl River Delta in Guangdong province, in the south of China, emigration from the south of China to the US in the late 19th and into the 20th century. Using family sources, and I'm hoping you are all thinking of your family sources as I describe these ones. Using family sources such as letters and notes from conversations, we worked out the route that Charles Wong would have taken from his village in Mengdi to San Francisco in 1909. So you can see Mengdi down in the lower left. He walked to Kaiping. He took a steamboat to Guangzhou and probably Hong Kong, although there was also a train between Guangzhou and Hong Kong. And then he took a larger ship from Hong Kong to San Francisco. The next slide. In 1923, when Charles brought Yi Shi to Beloit, they had first-class tickets on the Admiral Oriental line across the ocean from Hong Kong to Seattle. And then they took a train from Seattle to Beloit. And the book ends with a return in 2008 to Mengdi. Mary Wong Palmer and her family and friends, maybe a couple of people who are here, made a trip to see the place and try to reconnect with any remaining family. The next question is the who of the book. Well, it's mainly a biography of the three immigrant elders, grandfather, father, and mother Wong. And it's a biography of their children, the 7 Wong siblings who were born in and grew up in Beloit between 1924 and 1955. So if you were paying attention, you can figure out which one Mary is. And the children were Gim, Fong, George, Helen, Harry, Frank, and baby Mary. In the book, I divided the siblings into the older 3 and the younger 4, and explained that the older Wongs stayed local to help their mother and siblings after their father died. The oldest was 14. He was a freshman in high school. There were excellent opportunities for professional growth in Beloit once they advanced, in manufacturing and in the medical field. Gim served in World War II, attended University of Wisconsin, and became a mechanical engineer. He worked for several of the best-known Beloit firms, Yates American, Warner Electric, Fairbanks Morse, and Beloit Corp. Gim married and raised a family, and he served in several local government leadership positions, including as president and longtime member of the Beloit School Board. His son, by the way, served on the Beloit School Board for several of the last 10 years. He's no longer on it, but he was. Oldest daughter, Fong, was trained as a nurse in a wartime program and remained close to her mother, marrying and raising her family in Beloit. A highlight of Fong's legacy to the community is being part of the team that opened the Beloit's first emergency room. George, too, stayed close to his mother for a long time, marrying and starting a family in Beloit after service in the Korean War. He attended the University of Wisconsin to become an electrical engineer and enjoyed a career mainly with Beloit Corp. By the time he retired, he had 3 patents in paper machine technology. The younger siblings were not as tied to Beloit. First of all, their mother was well looked after, but also post-World War II opportunities called them and their spouses farther afield to Washington State, to Utah, and to California. Helen attended University of Wisconsin and became an occupational therapist, completing rotations in Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, and Hawaii. She married and raised a family not too far from home before heading west to Washington State, where she taught Chinese cooking classes and published a cookbook. Harry attended medical school at University of Wisconsin. I hope you're hearing a theme. Many of them educated at University of Wisconsin. In a shift from engineering, which his brothers had done, related to an industrial action he suffered when he worked at Fairbanks Morse as a teen, he moved to the medical field, and he started his practice and later opened an outpatient surgical facility in Salt Lake City, Utah, where he and his family raised their family. Frank was the only Wong who studied away from the state. Valedictorian of his class at Beloit Memorial, 500 students, he earned a full scholarship to Harvard University and became a professor of Chinese history and later a dean and provost. Having traveled and studied in Taiwan and China, Frank and his young family returned to Beloit in the 1980s, where he served as dean and provost at Beloit College. He's remembered for starting an exchange program with Fudan University in Shanghai, for defending diversity in academia, and for innovations in university structure. Mary attended University of Wisconsin too, like 5 of her siblings. She studied education and worked in Madison Public Schools. And she and her husband, David, started a family there and moved west to California for several years before returning right here to Wauwatosa. So Mary is the undisputed family historian and archivist. And this project is rooted in the decades of research she conducted and in our warm friendship. To address the how, we might focus on how the family was able to maintain such close ties despite the distances between them. And one chapter discusses the Wong family reunion, parties that were held every 5 years or so, beginning in the 50s. By meeting regularly, the extended family brings new members into the fold, and I witnessed this because I just went to the last one in Beloit last summer, and teaches them family values such as the importance of close family. So they had all of the new members, the fiancés, the new husband, stand up and introduce themselves to the 70 people present and say a little bit about themselves. It was amazing. Let's go to the next slide. Why was the book written? Well, the family had a number of members very interested and devoted to family history. Frank was a Chinese historian. Helen and George interviewed key family members on tape, and they sent questionnaires to gather information. And Mary, who had sizable archival holdings already, started traveling with David to the sites she knew family members lived in, such as Ogden, Utah, and sites with US government documentation of immigrant movement, like the National Archives in San Bruno, California. And in 2017, the family approached me to gather the stories and documents together and write up the book. And this is the book. So I'd like to, sort of as a closing, although it's a couple minutes long, talk about why the book was of interest to University of Wisconsin Press. So to follow the same pattern as earlier comments, this is to address the so what question. So important to historians. So what? Why is this important? What changes? What do we know? So first of all, it's a story about Chinese American immigrants in the Midwest. Most Chinese immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries came to California and the West, where they were employed in mining camps and on the railroads, and in addition to the service industries around those sectors, so restaurants and such. Like many immigrants, the Chinese came for opportunities provided in the US, but Chinese Americans experienced much racism in the West. Racism that stemmed from American imperialism in China, from religious and cultural differences, and from labor competition. At the worst of the anti-Chinese violence in the West, Chinese immigrants in Chicago invited their brethren to the Midwest, where there was less discrimination, less racism. Charles and several cousins answered that call. We aren't sure what attracted them to become small business owners in Beloit, Wisconsin. I mentioned the thriving economy. So hard to picture right now, right? Because Beloit isn't really thriving, although it's doing better. But may well have been the college, Beloit College. After the Boxer Rebellion, which was an uprising against Western missionaries and traders in China, the Western powers exacted hundreds of millions of dollars in indemnities from the Chinese. And a Beloit College-trained missionary named Arthur Henderson Smith suggested to President Teddy Roosevelt that the indemnity pay in part to educate Chinese elite in American universities. Remember that students were exempted from the anti-Chinese provisions in American immigration law. So in 1919, around 20 Chinese studied at Beloit College. 2 years before Yi Shi came, 1923, the Chinese Students Club at Beloit College sponsored an event to celebrate Chinese culture and raise money for famine relief in China. Nearly 500 people attended the event in Beloit, and students cleared about $200 for famine relief at 2 shows in Beloit and in Rockton, Illinois, northern Illinois. As the Chinese community in Chicago had broadcasted to their relatives in the West Coast earlier, overall there was less discrimination against Chinese in the Midwest than in the West. A second element that interested the publisher was that oral history as a source complemented the use of written documents from the National Archives. So if you're a historian or have studied history, you know that we often rely on written records, not so much on oral, because we feel like that might be flawed. People's memories might be diminished over time. But one piece of the family puzzle that we uncovered together involved this issue. The Wong children, Mary's siblings, knew that their grandfather was an herbal doctor who practiced in Chicago. They knew that he had applied for several of his nephews to immigrate to the US, but he hadn't sponsored his son, and their father. And why was the herbal doctor listed as a laborer in the written record? Mary's youngest uncle, who her siblings interviewed in 1981, explained the reason on a tape that was just sitting in the archives in the pile of stuff. And then, we did a transcript and heard this story a couple years ago. Their grandfather wasn't the first Wong to come to the US. His younger brother was. The younger brother had come as a 12-year-old in 1888, and he worked as a cook in the West for decades. But the younger brother died of the flu sometime between 1909 and 1912 when he was back in China. And in 1912, Mary's grandfather replaced his brother and came to the US using his name, the brother's name, even though he really didn't look much like his brother at that point. In fact, immigration officials were like, whoa, these two guys look different. And they really did. I wish I had a picture. But even though they didn't look that much alike, the officers sanctioned the change based on grandfather Wong's better economic class. Basically, grandfather Wong wasn't excluded because he was a medical doctor. He could read and write. He spoke English because he had customers in Hong Kong, right? So grandfather was a better economic class. In any case, a family mystery that was evident in the paper record was cleared up because family members had interviewed that uncle. And then another family member, Mary, saved the cassette tape. And then the final strength of the book for the State University Press was that the family history covers multiple generations and a full century of Chinese and American history. The book allows the reader to consider the effects of national policies and transnational events on members of a single family. Well, thank you for your attention.
Well, it's pretty amazing to be here doing this. In fact, a little bit emotional because I see familiar faces from long ago, and in our move to California, and with the pandemic, it feels like I still want to be in Wisconsin. So it was sort of like coming home again to be here. And I'm grateful that Brett was so interested. He really is good at convincing people to do things they don't want to do. Because I wasn't sure I wanted to do this. But I began by wanting to make sure that the story of my family was completed, because the two siblings who were most interested in it had died, and I had their material. And I felt that I needed to do this for future generations, because many of the grandchildren have intermarried. And so some of them have like a quarter Chinese in them, and they don't look Asian at all. And so I just felt like that needed to be told. And that was my motivation. So the family decided, well, okay, Mary, you do this and we'll self-publish it. So that was what we're gonna do. Then I'm introduced to Beatrice, who had a background of being in China and did not know there was a Chinese family in Beloit, Wisconsin. And so we got to talking, and I told her how I was trying to do this, and I didn't know where to go, how to finish, how to organize. And she came, and at the time she was living in Madison, and she came to Wauwatosa, to our house. We spread out all the materials that I had. She spent an entire day saying, look, Mary, you should do this, get notebooks, organize this. So I started doing that. And I got so far as to write a number of stories. But when it came right down to it, I had so much material that I really didn't know where to go, how to organize it, or how it was going to be published. And it was at that point that my brother, Harry, who is a retired anesthesiologist, and luckily, he was a doctor during the time when doctors made a lot of money, and he said, Mary, let me talk to Beatrice. And so he talked to her and asked if she would help and use the materials that I had, and she agreed to do that on her sabbatical. Meanwhile, my brother has made a number of contributions to Beloit College in the name of my mother, to try to keep that legacy alive in Beloit. Beatrice's skill and knowledge taught me so much about Chinese history, because living here, we just didn't observe many Chinese holidays except for Chinese New Year, because then I got that lishi, got that little red envelope with fresh money in it, and that was very exciting. And then my mother would really cook up a storm. That was really the only holiday. There just weren't any other observations. The other one was that in the summer, every weekend, we went to my father's grave. So, you know, if you read the book, you know that I was 17 months old when he was killed. And it wasn't until I was 12 years old that I found out that he had been killed. I thought he had died a natural death. And because my mother didn't speak English very well, and I didn't speak Chinese much, and it was World War II when I was growing up, so I didn't want anyone to know I was Asian because they would mistake me for Japanese. And my mother told me when I went to kindergarten, Mary, tell people that you're Chinese, not Japanese. And I thought, why would I do that? I'm an American, you know? I didn't know. And it was only until I was 40 years old when I met a Japanese-American woman who became one of my best friends in Berkeley, who had been relocated into one of these camps when she was 10 years old. And she was the oldest of 5, and they were all brothers. Essentially, their education stopped when they were relocated, but because she was 10, Quaker women who came to these camps would bring books for her to read and taught her while she was in these camps, so her education advanced. But her brothers suffered tremendously from being in there. And of course, her parents never regained their money or their home or whatever. So then I thought, Mom, that's why you said that. So here I am, 40 years old, and 35 years ago, my mom told me this, and I didn't know why. So this whole book and the research that Beatrice did educated me. I learned things that I never would have known otherwise. And so I'm just so grateful to her. And I want to encourage all of you who are here to do your family stories for your grandchildren and for your families. Beatrice is a specialist in oral interviews, and she's the one who encouraged me to interview my surviving. I had 3 surviving at that time when I met her and interviewed them, and I learned so much. I was 55 before I found out that when my father was killed, that a neighbor, the only single mother in the neighborhood besides my mother, took me into her home and cared for me because my mother had 3 children under 5 and really was depressed. And the neighbors said that she would cry herself to sleep, and they could hear, that was before air conditioning, her wailing because the windows would be open when it was hot. I never knew this. I thought my mother was very stoic because I never saw her cry. The only time I saw her sad was on the anniversary date of my father's death. And the reason I knew that was because I shared a bed with her, and the bed would shake. So, you know, I discovered so much and learned so much even about my brothers and sisters. And it refreshed my memory about things I knew, but only little tidbits. And I could finally put all this together. I still feel, I reread the book before I came, and I was marking things, and I thought, oh my gosh, if my parents were going to go back to China in 1936 because of the Depression and all the other issues. And my father had property in Hong Kong. So they put the house up for sale. And my older brothers and sisters, I remember telling me that their friends in school gave them going away parties. And the house didn't sell. So they all went back to school in the fall, and their friends said, "What are you doing here? We thought you were gonna go." Had they gone back, had the house sold in 1936, I was born in 1937. I don't know if I would have been born at all, or if I'd been born in Hong Kong. Had I been born in Hong Kong, I wouldn't be here tonight because I never would have met my husband. You know, life is so strange. There are points at which you go take one road and it leads you one way, and there are things that you don't know about had you taken this other road. And that's what this book has been about for me. And so I would like you to encourage you to try to tell those stories or to get them in writing or taped, however you can, so that you can share your family's history with your future grandchildren. Thank you so much for coming tonight.
The opportunity to be here with you all and hear these stories and having read the book, and we're going to provide you all an opportunity to ask some questions and share some thoughts, but I thought I'd get the ball rolling. And Mary, the question is for you. I read the book thinking that your mother was cut from a different kind of cloth, strong, but yet hearing the story today that very human in the midst of the pain and of losing a husband and a partner and the like. And I wonder now, at this chapter of your life, what's a memory, a story, an experience of your mom that really resonates with you today?
I think, looking back, it was after she died, and I think part of the eulogy that my brother Frank wrote about my mother, he was in education, and he wrote very well. I think that helped me think about her in a different way after she died. But when I've had difficult times in my life or challenges, even moving to California, sometimes I would get down and I'd think of my mom, and I'd say, if she could do it, I have to do it too, because she is my model of the kind of person who accepted life whatever it presented her. The only thing she didn't accept was that men landed on the moon. She told me that it was a photographic trick on television. Everything else she accepted. And so, you know, she couldn't communicate with me, but by example, you know, the life that she lived. And then when I found out more about her life, she's what I would like to be, and I have yet to achieve that.
You know, in our business here at the church, there's often throw around that phrase, WWJD. I think now we should probably start saying WWMWD. What would Mother Wong do in these situations? Well, thank you. I'm going to invite Lisa Lynn to come by. Do any of you have a question, a comment, a thought that you'd like to share that can allow us some time of conversation? Tony, I'm going to ask you to speak up nice and loud.
I will. Well, Mary, I'm so glad that you actually did the book, because way back, I mean, ever since I came to the U.S. in 1974, I was always puzzled. How did the first Chinese family ever settle down in places like Warsaw or Beloit or Racine? I think in Janesville, there was this first Chinese restaurant that is just celebrate 100 years anniversary. They called Cozy Inn. And way back, we were traveling in the Canadian Rocky, and we just drove past this tiny little lumber town, and lo and behold, there was one Chinese restaurant in this tiny little lumber town in the Canadian Rockies. So I'm so happy that you did it. And the other side of the story is that there were so many other stories to be told. I happen to know the lady who started this Cozy Inn in Janesville. Her former husband was one of the 6 who survived Titanic. There were 6 Chinese in the Titanic who people thought they were stolen away, but they were actually en route to the US, but they hired as a stoker. I think they shoveled coal into the boiler, and one of the 6 men who survived ended up in Milwaukee. And he fathered 2 sons, but he never talked about his own history ever and ever. So it's only like after the movie was made that we find out that we actually have one of these historical figure who was connected with Milwaukee. So I'm so happy that you did the book.
Mary, what was it like looking out over that table when Beatrice showed up and you had a century or so family history laid out there? What was your experience of being able to do your very best to see it from the top down? What stories did you see there?
I saw lots of different stories, but I couldn't see how they related to each other or how to put them all together. And she was so generous with her time and so gentle with my inability to do this. And she just coached me for years. Let's see, it would have been from when we met till Harry talked to you. How many years was that?
Maybe
7 or 8 years before my brother finally gave up on me and said, "Can I talk to Beatrice?" And so, you know, her willingness to do that, and then her research taught me so much. And as I said, we meant to just self-publish, but it became of interest to academicians in a way that it never would have otherwise.
Right here up front. Thank you. We're going to bring you the microphone.
Hi, Mary. I'm kind of curious when you said that you went to school and that your mom said to say you were Chinese, but yet you couldn't communicate with her. Does that mean that you never learned Chinese or that she never learned English? Or I'm just kind of curious about the language aspect. And I think of it because I have ancestors who were French and they never would speak French to us. And I kind of regret that they didn't bother. I took it in high school and never really learned it. So I'd like to know about your experience.
Yeah. My understanding was that when my grandfather was alive and would spend time, he'd come from Chicago, that the 2 older ones had to study with him and learn Chinese and write, so they learned a bit. But as the years went on, it was less and less so. There were so many kids, and we used to say we had our own language inside the house. It was a combination of Chinese and English. So any Chinese person coming in couldn't understand it, and any American person who came in couldn't understand it. So we called it Wongese. and so, you know, you just develop it. My mother started learning English more after TV, and after she had grandchildren who couldn't speak Chinese, and they would talk to her, and you know, on that primary level, and she would learn how to do that. So she got to be, you know, she was able to communicate, but still not fluently. But she demonstrated her love and affection in such a quiet way through food and just being ever present and smiling and having this wonderful disposition.
I'd like to add to that, and to say that Mary's daughter Sherry told me that they wondered for years whether Mary actually spoke Chinese, because she said she did, but when they went to Chinese restaurants, no one ever understood her. But when they went to southern China in 1984,
84.
A step aunt or some elder from the same village came to talk to her, and Sherry said they were just talking nonstop to each other in Chinese. And so all of a sudden it was evident she does speak Chinese. She speaks this really particular dialect.
the village was only 400, very remote village. And that's why many of the men left the village, and they had people doing farming and so forth. But as I said, it was this Wongese, but it was enough Chinese so that when I heard someone from the village, it sounded like my mother, and she had been gone for 6 years, so I hadn't spoken any or listened to any Chinese, and suddenly it just came out, and I started talking. And so here we had 10 days in China. Our daughter was 16 years old at the time, and someone said, "What was the best thing about China?" She said, "I learned my mother really does know how to speak Chinese." The whole trip, you know, we went down the Yangtze River, and that was the important thing, so.
Mary, I am kind of curious about marriage in your generation. Now, like me, you married a Guelo, and I'm curious how your mom felt about intermarriage and whether that was ever an issue in your family.
Did you hear that, Mary?
About my marriage?
About how your mom felt about intermarriage with you and Dave, and in general? Intermarriage between, right, you got it.
I could ask the same question of you. Well, because I had 3 older siblings who did not marry Chinese, but my 3 younger siblings, close in age to me, all married Asians. I think my mother had come to the point where she accepted the intermarriage. Plus, she knew that she thought David would have a good job and he'd be able to support me. And so he might be a suitable husband. So, you know, but at first, it was very difficult. I remember her saying to me, because we were dated in high school. So we went together for over 7 years after we graduated from college, we decided to get married. And my mother said, "You're so young, you know, you're 22. Why don't you come home and teach in Beloit and live with me for a while?" You know, she was reluctant to give up her last child, knowing that, you know, we wouldn't be living there. And I understand that. But she accepted it because we were in Madison for 5 years, and I made sure that I did a lot for my mom so that she wouldn't miss me as much.
To that end, I remember this conversation, a point in the book regarding David's parents and the potential of a mixed-race wedding and union. How did that conversation go, or did it ever?
Well, we were juniors in college, and we had been dating exclusively since high school. And the previous summer, we took a trip east and visited his maiden aunt, she was living in Virginia at the time. And I think she was worried about David getting serious with me. And so I do feel she influenced her sister, his mother. Mm-hmm. So I was at college and I got a letter in the mail written by the father, but I'm sure it was the mouthpiece of the mother, saying, you know, we like you and everything, but we really think that you ought to break up and date people of your own kind. Mm. And I thought, who's my own kind? I didn't know who my own. So I was in Madison. So I can't imagine students today doing it, but we did that. We obeyed. We broke up. He tried to date people. I dated Chinese, and the only Chinese in Madison were foreign students, and they were graduate foreign students who were scientists, who had labs. And when they found out that I was free and dated, I was like one of probably 10 women in the 1950s who were available to date. And these men were just, I mean, I had calls, all these Chinese foreign students calling me. And I went on like a couple of dates and I thought, oh my God, what do I have in common with these people? And so, you know, we tried. And I thought, they're not my people. You know, I grew up in this country. I'm not very Chinese, I guess. So we did, and then his folks said, if you break up and then decide that you still want to get married, we will accept it. So I guess they did, because they loved our children. They were worried about biracial children. And when we'd had children, they turned out to be their favorites. So.
Thank you.
Well, Mary, this has been wonderful to hear. I'm probably the only one in this audience who knew Mary and David when they were dating back in Beloit High School. And I always looked up to you and to David. In fact, I really thought David was cool. So, but you were 2 years older than I. So anyway, this has been wonderful learning more about your family. I remember going to your restaurant. My mom and dad loved that restaurant. And we went often as a treat to have some Chinese food. But I sure never knew any of the rest. So I'm very happy that you've written this book, and I can only imagine how much this means to you, that you have this all down, you know, for others to read and keep and cherish. So thank you. I will be buying a copy. We've been reading a little bit of Heidi's copy, and now we want our own. So thank you very much.
Well, so this is Sarah Euling, who was in the band with us. I played a French horn poorly, and I dropped out. David was the lead trumpeter, and I always wanted dimples from the time I was a child. He has the best dimples of anyone I'd ever seen at that time, and I thought, hey, I like that guy. I'd like those dimples. But anyway, yeah, we dated, and Sarah was in the band, so she knew. I had a childhood friend from when I was about 3 years old who read the book and heard about it, lives in Madison. And when she read the book, she said, it was all the same places. She went to the Presbyterian church that we went to, you know. And so I've had contacts with people from my past that I haven't heard from forever. And it's pretty emotional, so to say the least.
Hello, Mary. My question has to do with when you went to the village in China. How did you identify that village? How did you connect with it? And what was that experience like, being there? And, you know, just tell me more about it.
Well, you know, when you're on a tour, you're always limited in time. And because we didn't know for sure whether this was the village or not, all I had was a scrap of paper written in Chinese of the name of the village that some older cousins had given me. And so our national guide did a lot of research because he was closer to our age, and he respected people who were coming back to try to find out about their heritage. So we were told to go to the closest big city, we thought, and find the oldest person that we could find and ask them show up the paper and say, do you know of this village? Because it's not on the map anywhere. Our daughter is at Stanford, and she gave it to every Chinese person that she knew to see if they could translate it. And they said no, because when the communists took over, they simplified the Chinese language. So this was written in classical Chinese, and many of these people couldn't read it. So find the oldest person. So we'd do this, we'd stop along the way, and the guide would get out and talk to them and try it, and then we'd go a little bit farther, and finally, we found a young man on a motorcycle who had been to the village, and he said he could lead us there. So we had a little bus, and he led us a ways, and then there was no road. There was only a path. So we had to get out of the bus, and we had to walk, and we didn't know how far we were going to walk. He's taking his motorcycle, and he's way ahead of us. We can hardly see him, and we're still walking, and it's a hot, hot day. Finally, 45 minutes later, we come to this archway, and the national guide reads it, and he says, Mong Di. And he said, this is a Wong village. Well, there might have been many Wong villages. We don't know for sure. But we think it's the same because when we took pictures of the fish pond that my cousins who had lived in the village talked about, and 2 banyan trees, we took a picture and they said, that's the place. They remembered it. So whether it was or not, I really don't know. But we had limited time, and when I went in there, it was so overwhelming. I don't know what went through my head. One thing I saw, there was a real low cement stoop that I went and sat on, and I wondered if my father, as a child, had sat on that stoop. I tried to picture my mother in this village. I knew that she had to, as a daughter-in-law, obey her mother-in-law, and she took care of children and did things like that. But it was a very primitive village at that time. There was no running water, no indoor facilities. So it was so emotional. I don't know what went through my head. All I thought was, I think this is where my father started, which means maybe, that belongs to me too. And now, I'm too old, I'll never go back again, but I hope that maybe my grandchildren will. I don't know. And of course, you know that because you've gone back to your, yeah.
While Lisa Lynn gets over to Leanne, I wanted to ask you, Beatrice, as a historian who looks at immigration and who encountered this narrative coming forward, what touch points would you highlight for folks like myself who are hearing a lot of these stories in any sort of personal detail for the first time? What's something that really sticks out to you about this era, about this story, that in your mind needs to be shared?
That's a very large question.
Well, pick whatever part you'd like to talk about.
So a few minutes ago, when you were asking how David's parents and Mary's mother felt about their marriage, I was reminded that we often ignore legal history, and it was illegal in, I think it was 15 states until 1967 for people of different races to marry. And that was, registrars were upholding that law actively. When people came before them, they said, there's a law, you can't get married. And so when Mary at the beginning was talking about what would have happened if her parents had moved to Hong Kong, I'm just constantly struck by all of the moments in time that you made this choice. You didn't make that one. I'm not the kind of historian that says, what would have happened if? I'm not actually that one. But when you're on this path, what were the laws and policies in place that encouraged or allowed you to make that decision? And by you, I mean anyone, any decision, any point in history. I mean, that is fascinating to me. So for you, I hope when you think about your own lives, especially those of you who are in your 70s, 80s, and telling these stories, think about that, about what allowed you, how come all of these kids went to University of Wisconsin? It was cheaper then. It was affordable then, right? Their family could do it. It's so much harder now to go to University of Wisconsin. It's so much more expensive. So just be aware that there are reasons that we can take a path, and sometimes those paths aren't available to others.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Leanne to ask her question here, and then if that would be just fine, we will use this to wrap up and invite everyone to a reception where, of course, you can continue to spend time with each other and with Mary and Beatrice. Leanne, did you have you have the microphone, perfect.
Hi, Mary. Leanne Fraley. So wonderful to see you and Dave back in the sanctuary. So my question sort of has two parts. I feel like you've brought an incredible amount of wisdom to us tonight. And so the first part of my question is, how would you suggest those of us who have tried to get those stories from our parents and grandparents, the books, the whatnot, and they sort of seem reticent to share for whatever reason, like what would you tell them? What should I be telling my parents to say, like, we really want to capture this history? And the second part is, you've mentioned grandchildren and those that are coming after you that you hope will continue this exploration. There's so much resilience in this story that I find so inspiring. If this place were filled with teens or young adults, what would you want them to hear as they go back out into the world? Again, because I think you've just provided us with a lot of wise counsel this evening, and I want it to go beyond the people sitting here tonight.
Repeat that clearly for me. Two parts.
Number one was, Leanne, jump in if I get this wrong. The back half of the question was essentially, what would you tell a space like this filled with young adults about the journey and what you've picked up along the way? Is that fair? Following this history, and then we'll jump back to the other part in a second. So what would you share with as many young adults and teenagers about following the history, advice that you gave them that you could give them at this point in their lives?
Take as much opportunity as you can to meet as many kinds of different people, find out about them, learn their stories, know people as individuals. I helped, some of you remember Rhoda, used to teach, Rhoda Mueller, taught a graduate class for social studies, and I used to go in just to talk about the difference in cultures. And the first thing I would do when I went into this classroom, I was saying to the students, who do you think I am? Every single one of them would say Chinese. Not one would say a wife or a mother or a teacher. They saw my face, and that's what I was, not who I was inside. I must say also, are you still on the school board, Leanne? I want to say that my oldest brother did not speak any English when he started kindergarten. My step-nephews came from China and had no English. The public schools, to me, are the leveling influence on society where people of different backgrounds, economic, can learn, can meet, not necessarily be friends, but know that there are other kinds of people. I'm sorry if there are people that I offend, but I know that a lot of these charter schools or choice schools, the population of the student body is so homogeneous that there's no interaction with other kinds of people. So that's the first part. The second part?
You actually answered the first part with your second part. That was perfect.
You did wonderful. Well, I want to say thank you to both of you, to Mary and to Beatrice, for not only flying all the way up from, you were in Europe just very recently, correct? And now from Oregon and from California, and to be with here this evening. You're all, of course, welcome to come back tomorrow. Starting at 9 a.m., we'll have down in our fellowship hall a bit of a very kind of personal conversation, not about personal stuff, but just, friends chatting with you all. And I am humbled and thankful that this story can be shared. I'll say just personally that this represents here, and Beatrice and Mary, I hope I can get you to sign it at some point. This represents the 4th copy of this book that I have owned, because every time I talk about what we're doing here or or your story, somebody wants to read it. And so I've given out 3 of these. My mother-in-law in West Virginia, family out in, all over the place. One of them just literally just disappeared from my desk. But this story is resonating with a lot of folks, and I am very thankful that you all came out here. And we just would love to show our appreciation. Well, friends, the reception has been laid out with wonderful locally made desserts. There's coffee as well as bathrooms right on the other side of this wall. Friends, we'll look forward to seeing you out in what's called our gathering space.